Hello and welcome back to a mid-Friday edition of the No Apologies live stream. Very impromptu, but I'm here with some very interesting, very important, and I assume very familiar people if you are following what's happening with Heel Turn or just generally have an internet connection, say, over the last 5 or so years. So I'm joined today by Augustus Invictus and Nils Wegner. We're here to talk about Carl Schmitt. How are you two doing today, gentlemen?
Doing well, thanks, man.
Yeah, just great. Everything's fine.
So in the event that maybe people don't know who you are, we'll start with Nils. Just maybe give us a brief introduction, tell us who you are, what's going on in your life professionally or what have you, and maybe tell us a little bit about why you're attracted to the work of Carl Schmitt, and that would go for both of you.
Well, all right. I've been studying and graduating in historical and cultural sciences at the University of Gießen in Hamburg. BA in Gießen first and MA in Hamburg, and wrote my thesis in Gießen about the political life of a pair of brothers in the 1950s and 60s in the young Federal Republic of Germany that were both influenced by Carl Schmitt and one of his first scholars, Armin Mohler, who was also one of the founders of the New Right in Germany. And this thesis was supervised by Professor Dirk van Laak, who himself wrote his original dissertation about the intellectual implications and the consequences that Carl Schmitt as a person and his political thought had in the early Federal Republic. And after being done with university, I went to work for Antaios, the foremost and most famous, I guess, publishing house of the New Right in the German-speaking world for about 3 years. And it's been a bit about Carl Schmitt because he is such a paragon of political thought in our circles. So it never really left me ever since university, and I'm pretty glad that I guess, developed a pretty good understanding for his thought now, so I can start to help.
Great stuff. And Mr. Invictus, let's turn that back to you. Tell the audience a little bit about what you do and why Mr. Schmitt's work is important to you.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, what I do professionally is I'm an attorney, criminal defense. And actually, the reason I'm in criminal defense is because Carl Schmitt literally changed my life and the course of my life. I was actually in international law when I was in Chicago for law school, worked at a think tank, was an internationalist, pretty left-wing humanitarian sort of think tank, though I didn't really understand that at the time. But I was working for a professor, and we were writing, things on the laws of war, right? And there was a part in the paper that we were working on where my professor had said that Hobbes said that truth, not authority, makes law. And it was in Latin, and I knew that this is wrong. This can't be correct. This is not what Hobbes would say. It doesn't sound very Hobbesian to me. So I had to look it up, and in looking it up, I found Carl Schmitt. And it actually was authority, not truth, makes law, and it is the basis of all Schmitt's philosophy. And then I started reading Concept of the Political, Crisis of Parliamentarian Democracy, all those good old books, and that completely disillusioned me with everything I've been working for, everything about internationalism, the United Nations, public international law as we know it today. It just, Schmitt's critique of liberalism and the liberal international order actually just completely destroyed my entire worldview. And so I left international law and went home to do criminal defense instead.
Great stuff. So in anticipation of this show, there's a very interesting article that popped up on Financial Times. I've made it available both for the gentlemen in this conversation and the chat. And I thought we would just take maybe a moment or two to look at this, use it as a springboard, and kind of get into some of the topics we had set up for today. Because as we were saying before we went live, the author of this article, let me pull it up in front of you right now, Gideon Rockman. I'm going to put this on share with the rest of the audience. There's a kind of interesting belief that Carl Schmitt is suddenly, he's been ripped out of the crypt. No one's been paying attention to this guy for decades, and just suddenly and inexplicably, Carl Schmitt is relevant again. So I'll start with Mr. Wegner. What are your thoughts when you saw this? Is Schmitt more relevant now than ever before? Start wherever you'd like.
Yeah, I mean, of course, a journalist such as Mr. Ruckman, who seems to be the chief foreign affairs commentator for the Financial Times and worked for The Economist before. Of course, journalists need a current matter to hook their texts on. And I mean, look at this header picture. You got Carl Schmitt in one of his I have to say less great photographs, surrounded by Richard Spencer on the left side, one of his famous Charlottesville photographs. And on the other side, you have Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the Turkish president, and you have Donald Trump, obviously, and you have the Chinese leader Xi Jinping. So obviously we have some gentlemen gathered together by some poor intern at the Financial Times editing offices, who had to cobble together from open sources some power individuals of these days to drive the whole point forward and to serve as some kind of launching pad for this whole article, which is obviously rather short for even discussing anything Schmitt in his very prolific career as a writer and a philosopher put out there. But it's mainly just a summary of the rather theoretical half of Schmidt's English Wikipedia article, I'd say, but omitting while doing so most of the facts, because there's literally no, or virtually almost no sentence in this whole article that is wrong. That's not wrong. He talks about Schmitt being the premier legal theorist of Nazi Germany. Of course, we can get into the history of that later, but on the other hand, he also influenced, to a certain degree, or is rumored to have influenced the German constitution, the Grundgesetz, and even if the Jewish religious philosopher Jakob Taubes is to be trusted, the early drafts of Israel's constitution. So someone like Mr. Ruckman should probably know better to insinuate such things that might make Mr. Schmitt just a little more dangerous and therefore more interesting to a rebellious crowd, which would probably not read the Financial Times. But in the days of Twitter, things like this get around pretty fast and pretty well. So this article is not connected to anything very recent in our days, except maybe for the usual howling about Russia and the evil Alexander Dugin, who recycled some of Schmitt's ideas for his fourth political theory. But anyway, it's a nice plug for today's show, and I think we can use it pretty well as our launching pad to delve into some of Schmitt's thoughts and ideologems, if you want to call it that.
And Mr. Invictus, any thoughts that you had about it? I know you only had a precious few minutes to take a look at it, but any thoughts that you had?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree that the article's just a bit slanted, probably has an agenda behind it. But that being said, I'm glad for it. I like this article. And, I'm a big metalhead, have been since I was a kid. And one of the snobby things we metalheads do is we get mad when, you know, our favorite bands get big. They get commercial success, and we'd say, oh, those guys sold out. You know, but I like seeing this, that liberalism's most brilliant enemy is back in vogue. It makes Schmitt out to be like a rock star. And that kind of sexiness, that could cause some bigger appeal. And I think, you know, just like me when I was in law school, people actually sat down and read what Carl Schmitt said. It would change everything. You know, hopefully for Rockman, hopefully people just read secondhand information. Hopefully they just read the Vogue articles or, you know, Financial Times or whatever, because if they sit down and read the books, it's game over for the liberal international order.
Yeah, I have to say, I'm the neophyte of everyone on this call. I only started reading Schmitt in the last maybe year or two after getting involved with you guys, frankly, you know, indirectly. And you read those books, Political Theology, The Concept of the Political, and they just eviscerate liberalism entirely. And I think to me, the importance of this article isn't anything that it has to say about Carl Schmitt or anything like that, but it tells us that liberalism is in a very tenuous and weak place, that they're trotting out the greatest critic, who's still very much relevant, but they kind of they're dusting him off, and they're kind of pulling him off the shelf, saying, well, you know, all this liberalism that has been good for so long for so many people, well, it's just oddly this Schmitt guy and his, you know, his critiques make a little bit of sense. I want to start with Mr. Wegner, and I want to ask you if you can talk to us a little bit about the theory of the partisan and why that's relevant for us here today.
All right. In the theory of the partisan was kind of the product of two lectures Schmitt gave in the early 60s at a Spanish military academy. His daughter was married to a Spanish official and former Frankist, and there he talked about how the concepts of war, and war being in effect just a prolongation of politics and a means of politics, had changed since the dawning of modernity. Some of you followers or people who are familiar with certain writers within the alt-right and outside of it may be familiar with this whole concept of generations of warfare by William Lind, I guess it was, and that kind of goes into the same direction, because the usual war that was fought between the old nation states would be over, or already was over, by the time this book was published in 1963 originally. Because Schmitt, in his earlier book, The Nomos of the Earth, saw the nation states as the founding of the European political order come to an end. And after the nation states, something else would have to emerge, because power does not tolerate any vacuum. Something would inevitably flow into this empty space and occupy it. And to prevent this from happening, the European states, or they be gone, the European peoples would have to devise something else. The partisan, to Schmitt, was kind of a metaphor for this changing phase of war and thus of politics, because the nation states, with their big armies that we see before in our eye when we, for example, envision the wars of liberation against Napoleon, or the war of Prussia against France, and Prussia against Austria, and Prussia, what have you. They were part of the past, and instead, especially the Second World War, but also already the First World War with the so-called francs-tireurs and and other irregular troops, showed the emergence of the partisan as some kind of political archetype. Schmitt made out 4 distinct features of the partisan: that it was an irregular individual, not wearing any uniform and moving secretively. Just like Chairman Mao, for example, said, the partisan, or in his case, the freedom fighter or the guerrillero or whatever you want to call it. It probably always depends on your own political position towards the given fighter. He moves inside the people as a fish would move in water, because he is not wearing a uniform and using the mass of people in modern mass societies to disguise himself and to literally submerge whenever he is about to be sought out. The second feature would be that he was an individual that was fanatically driven by a certain idea. And that correlates with Schmitt's concept of the political itself, because politics, being grounded on the distinction between friend and enemy and potential conflicts between these two poles, have to finally come to an end by making peace. This is what real politics looks like. It is a conflict of interest that has to be fought out in one way or the other. Open, deadly war is just one of those ways, but in the end there has to be some kind of peace, preferably by some peace treaty, and the partisan as a concept makes this impossible, because he is not a solid, concrete political party like a nation state would be, with whom another nation state that is attacked by the partisan could make peace with. The third feature of the partisan, which correlates with him being irregular, is that he is highly mobile and able to strike and then suddenly disappear, as we have seen in the war of France, in China, and then in Vietnam, and ever since in this so-called irregular or asymmetrical wars. With the fourth and final element of the partisan being his, as Schmitt called it, telluric character. That means he is bound to his soil that he stands and lives and fights upon. That this somehow resonates in this twist of words, for which the Mujahideen, or later the Taliban, would be, I guess, the best example. Because when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan and the CIA supported the Mujahideen with weapons and technology, what have you, especially the Stinger missiles that would later be used against when they invaded. Then, within the Cold War scenario, those Mujahideen were freedom fighters. And just a few decades later, when the whole political situation had turned and the perspectives had turned, and they started to attack targets outside of their own state and that were not on their own home soil, they would become terrorists by not doing anything, or at least not too much differently than what they had done before. So these were the four characteristics and the meaning of the partisan to Schmitt. But already back in 1963, before the large escalation of the Vietnam War and what we have seen ever since then, Schmitt noted that the telluric character of the partisan was something that would change soon, because he saw the world growing closer and closer together, the global village, or what fancy term we use nowadays. And so the telluric character would become less important and also less easy to follow through, because their an own soil to grow upon would be more and more difficult to find. That is basically the concept of the partisan in a nutshell, I guess.
Well, very thorough. I appreciate that. And we can kind of see, I'll kick this over to Mr. Invictus, or Emperor Invictus, in just a moment. But, you know, we see that concept of the partisan play out, not just in, you know, foreign conflicts, but domestic conflicts as well. Here, I mean, you can look at really any political rally organization over the last few years. I mean, we can go back farther, really, but it's escalated quite a bit. Post-Trump, we see these guerrilla type actors at these rallies. Now, of course, they have their affiliations, George Soros and these kinds of things, but they go in and they're basically agitating and acting in an aggressive way, but because of their lack of, you know, official affiliation, they can kind of, as you said before, they're like the fish in the water. They can just go back in and out whenever they want. Any thoughts on that, Invictus?
Yeah, because I think it goes to what Mr. Wegner was talking about with the telluric nature of the partisan versus the internationalist nature of a terrorist, which Schmitt talks about. And I think that's tied in intimately with what I think is the biggest distinction between the partisan and the terrorist, which is what he talks about with, like, let's say, Lenin, for instance, with absolute enmity. So one of Schmitt's biggest contributions to legal philosophy or even political philosophy is the distinction between friend and enemy, as Mr. Wegner had mentioned earlier. So in Theory of the Partisan, Schmitt starts talking about the difference between knowing your real enemy and having absolute enmity toward whoever it is. When you think about partisans, guerrilla fighters against Napoleon in Spain, for instance, they're fighting for their land, they're fighting against an invader, they might be in a regular army, but they're tied to that soil and they have an enemy, and as soon as the enemy's gone, okay, you know, that we're done with this war. You think about guerrilla fighters elsewhere in the world, and it's we're repelling a foreign invader, we're fighting for this, that, or the other. Like Salan is one of his big examples here. And Salan was not in France when this happened, but the French government, to his mind, stabbed him in the back, and he was declaring war against the Algerians. And then when the French government stabbed him in the back, he also declared a civil war against his own government. And in that instance, he became a partisan, but he also was a national hero to a lot of people. Totally different when you think of somebody like Lenin, who is an internationalist, who is not fighting necessarily for soil, but for an ideology. And his enemy is not the Algerians or the French government. His enemy is not even the Russian Tsar or, you know, the White Army or any of them. His enemy is anyone who stands in the way of revolutionary communism. And anyone who is not a revolutionary communist is not even human. And that's like one of the big ideological contributions of Schmitt too, is this notion that liberalism itself has taken that route. Say Wilson's war to end all wars, or we're going to bomb democracy into anybody who disagrees with us, because anybody who's not on this same timetable as us, anybody who's not democratic, they're barbaric. They're of an age past, and they need to be bombed into submission before they drag the rest of the world into the dark ages. So the same thing is true of the revolutionary communists, and you move from having a real enemy that you can defeat and you can bring back into the fold, or even honor, as in the case of the U.S. Civil War, when we would have monuments for both sides. In communism, you have to wipe out the enemy because they're not even human. They need to be rid from the earth. And I think that's one of the bigger distinctions there too.
Yeah, very well said. I would just add one thing to that, and then we can hear again from Mr. Wegner, which is, one of the major, I guess, issues in terms of American politics is just that the right maybe even the dissident right struggles with this friend-enemy distinction. There's no clear sense of, or there's not a correct sense of who we really stand in opposition against. The political left, communists, our trusted flagger types here on YouTube, they have a very strong sense of who they stand in opposition to. They have a very long historical sense of it. They have a visceral sense of it, as you pointed out. Again, we saw this with like the southern monuments being torn down and still being torn down, which is,
Right.
the East has to go because they represent our foe. I'm not trying to be cute and rhyme here, but any last thoughts on that, Mr. Invictus? Otherwise, we'll kick it over.
Yeah, actually, toward the end of that book, Theory to the Partisan, Schmitt seems to be making a normative statement that this is a bad thing. That this absolute enmity, this evolution we've seen from the partisan to this internationalist sort of movement that's not tied to the soil, that has absolute enmity and wants to wipe out their opponents. This is a bad thing, and hopefully we can get back to the way things were. And I think that's the way a lot of conservatives and right wingers and alleged patriots think about things is, well, these punk kids and the Antifers, they're just, they just need a good spanking and then they're going to go back to normal and we can get back to being America. And that's just not how it's going to work. At this point, if we are not willing to embrace that absolute enmity, we're going to be wiped out. And the thing with, being a Southerner and watching all this unfold with the monuments, it's come very close to home. And it's right there in your face that if you don't wake up to this and embrace that absolute enmity against the people trying to annihilate you, you will be annihilated. So I think we're a little past that, regretful, oh, let's go back to the way things were sort of mentality.
I totally agree. Nils, any thoughts?
Yeah, signed. I guess the problem is, and I've been noticing this in the right-wing world quite often, especially in Germany, because just this week the Alternative für Deutschland party was named by our domestic intelligence service as a case to further examine or to scrutinize, and all the press outlets that were just waiting for the Feds to announce that they were officially watching the AfD, which in Germany kind of means, okay, they are now declared pariah by a state agency, so don't do business with them anymore. What's that strange number again for when in the US you found a society or something like that and want to be exempted from taxes?
501c3.
Yeah, exactly. That can be revoked when your organization is watched by domestic intelligence. And funnily enough, this domestic intelligence service is named Federal Office for the Protection of the Constitution, which is a name that already rings very Schmittian. But I guess they would defend themselves against such insinuations. What really baffles me over and over again is that so many people on the right, both in Europe and in the US, declare that they had read Schmitt, that they had understood Schmitt, that Schmitt was great and brilliant and saw things through, and then they cry out loud about such actions. Or I don't mean to insult anyone who's been at Charlottesville and been and has been running the gauntlet and stuff like that, but experiencing something like that, having an intellectual background that is informed by Schmitt, and then going on to cry out about such things is contradictory, to say the very least, because Schmitt's thought was very cold in this regard, and very bereft of any values. To Schmitt, the central term is order. In the beginning, there is order, and then people coming together and agreeing upon a certain order of society or community that they want to give them the constitution as a manifest expression of the order they wish to execute. And from this constitution springs a state as the political manifestation of this constitution and the guardian of the given order. And of course, this guardian can be overtaken by hostile elites or a party holacracy and what have you, what we see in Western liberal societies now that Mr. Rahman feels he has to defend. And of course, those people won't let go of that power. They have it, they want to keep it because it nurtures them, and they probably know what could happen to them if they ever lose it. So they cling to it and use it as they wield the power like a sword against people challenging it. That is the whole nature of political power struggles. And just because our enemy, humanitarian and liberal terms, to disguise his ability and his readiness to fight, and to fight quite dirty, as we have all seen within the last few decades, does not mean that they wouldn't do it. And anyone who has ever hoped for something like this, whilst claiming that he was a Schmittian in the narrow sense, must have misunderstood some pretty visceral points, or he's a bit of a loudmouth.
Well, so I was going to ask you this. You kind of answered it, but I'll give both of you an opportunity to take a swing at this. So we've got these people who profess to be Schmittians, and they profess to be steeped in this. I say right wing. We all say right wing. It's not perfect language, but I think everyone knows what we mean. They're steeped in this right wing philosophy and all this literature. And then, as you say, kind of foolishly, not to put words in your mouth, complain about the outcomes of their political organization. My question to both of you is, maybe they're loud mouths, maybe they didn't read Schmitt too deeply. Why do we see this lack of internalizing the friend-enemy distinction and the absolute enmity as Schmitt and we're all discussing? Anyone who wants to take that first, go ahead.
Well, I've been talking for so long. Augustus, you want to go?
Yeah, as far as why people don't internalize it, I suppose that's, you could generalize that to, why do people profess to be Christian and they don't follow the teachings of Christ? Why do Buddhists own, material possessions? I mean, I guess it's just the human nature to say, I intellectually think these things, but I haven't really internalized them and acted on them. As far as the Charlottesville thing, I mean, I was there. I was one of the headline speakers. I was deeply invested in it and involved. I watched the whole thing go down, and I've complained about it a lot. But I think what Mr. Wegner is saying is pretty accurate and compelling, that you can't talk about the power of the state and then complain when the state turns that power against you. If you go into politics not understanding that you are going to be attacked from all angles at all times, then you're either going to get that naivete beaten out of you, or you're going to be completely driven out of politics forever. So if you're going to complain about it, it shouldn't be from the point of, well, the government is evil, so let's burn down the government. These sorts of mechanisms that we've placed in trust of bureaucrats, we've got to get rid of them all. The argument shouldn't be that. I mean, the state might be legitimate, the mechanisms might be legitimate. What's illegitimate is the ideology being enforced. So what you should be complaining about is corruption, the ideology of these people, the mass, the mob mentality, and the overt communism in the city of Charlottesville. But yeah, as far as complaining that, they turned the police on us, well, of course they did. And I don't think anybody in their right minds that's Schmittian, if that's the word we're going with now, is, going to say that this is inexcusable, it's evil, because, you know, if the tables were turned, of course the police should be turned on the leftists who actually started the violence. The real complaint is the ideology that these people have to begin with, because they are an absolute enemy, and they've labeled us that too.
Yeah, very fair point. I would say, you know, even a little bit more strongly, it's not the ideology that's bad. I mean, it is, but it's the people. It's the people enacting the ideology.
Touche.
Yeah. So another concept, unless there's anything you wanted to add, Nils?
I guess there's a lot of stuff that various people have already noted, like Spencer and others. I believe Augustus did it as well. It is a general problem of conservatism of any ilk, that there is this kind of genetically fixed need to trust institutions, because there's you will always find people in any case, as well as now with the AfD being kind of manhandled by domestic intelligence, and the identitarian movement being watched by domestic intelligence and stuff like that. You will always find this conservative type who says, yeah, it's not a problem of the system itself and the people who handle it, and the institutions. The institutions are great, and we represent the silent majority, and in reality, the police is on our side, and the domestic intelligence as well, and etc., etc., etc. Quite the opposite of what people like James Burnham and Sam Francis would say. They would say this whole governmental body, the clerks, are the real enemy, because they are just mercenaries who will serve any lord and do nothing to contradict him if he demands something unethical from them. They want to trust those authorities and institutions for, I guess, a lot for self-reassurement, because it's quite harsh a revelation when you find yourself standing against the whole political system of your given state, or whatever you have decided to commit thought crime against. And conservatives are not hardwired for that, because they need to feel that they are eventually on the right side of history, and going against the police or the bureaucracy and what have you would mean that they were a bit more rebellious as they would want themselves to be. That's just my take on this. Trying hard not to insult anyone.
No, that was very diplomatic, but I also say very, very, very well said. There seems to be like a kind of self-preservation or an existential quality. I don't, you know, if I put on my normie conservative hat, I don't want to think of myself as being a firebrand or outside of the system, outside of my community. And again, that you bring up the genetic point of view, it may simply have to do with the fact that these people are not as good at fending for themselves in the wild, so to speak. These commie liberal, I mean, whatever euphemistic language we want to use, the enemy, they are much better equipped at this. They have a more, it seems, hypothesizing here a little bit, and I'll turn it over to Augustus for his thoughts in just a second. But there does seem to be a quality of, you know, greater sense seeking, more porous psychological boundaries between the people around them. Maybe that gives these people a kind of a leg up, an evolutionary advantage in these kinds of situations we find ourselves. Any thoughts, Augustus?
Yeah, I think that's probably intuitively true. I mean, like, just one example I often give is that between the Romans and the Celts, where when the Romans showed up to Britain, the Celts were still coming out to the battlefield one at a time in a chariot, you know, trying to be the big G on campus. You know, it's like, I'm here to fight. Who wants to fight me? And the Romans are like, that's not how we do things. And they would just mow them over because they were organized. They fought in organized units, and obviously they were going to take down any one at a time one-comers. We see a lot of that going on in America right now. The right-wingers, especially in America, where the tradition here is the frontiersman, the pilgrim, the standalone gunslinger. Like, that's what we value, and that's the archetype we think of as an American. But when you have that standalone cowboy going against the entire machine, he's outgunned, he's outmanned. Like, it's not even a fight. So at this point, it's just like I was talking about the difference between knowing the real enemy and then absolute enmity, where we are still like, well, we know who the real enemy is. It's international finance. It's not the Antifa. They're a distraction. The real enemy are the bankers and the people pulling the strings behind the scene. Well, yeah, that's fine. But at the same time, if you don't have absolute enmity against those people, then you are like that cowboy. You're outgunned, you're outmanned, and you're just going to be run over by the machine. And the same thing is true of that standalone tactic. Like, if we don't learn to work together, and we hold stubbornly to this hyper individualistic ideal of one man against the world, well, we're going to lose. So I'd reiterate and endorse everything you just said.
Again, yeah, I agree. There's the Americana ethos is so strong in the mind of American right wingers, and I like that you say that the hyper individualized sense there seems to be maybe we could say it has to do with the culture and the geography of America and all these kinds of things and the history of the founding stock. We can go with Nils's kind of biological explanation. The left wing, the enemy, embodies an archetype very different from that Americana, as you say, gunslinger. I'm on my horse. It's just me. My property, my private property, my borders. You can't cross my borders because I got my gun. This right-wing fantasy of, well, if they ever come for me, I'm going to pull out my shotgun, and they're not going to mess with me because Merc and right-wingers, we got all the guns, we've got all the the machismo or whatever. The left wing they embody this completely different archetype. And to pivot to, I think, probably the last topic we have time for here, the concept of embodying authority, which is another thing for Schmitt's work, the idea of the sovereign being the force that I don't want to pack too many ideas in one thought, so I'll make this simple as I can. The concept of the sovereign as the singular authority that can act and knows when to act. That's something internationally and domestically left-wingers seem to be psychologically better adept at. Nils, do you want to comment on that?
That's kind of a complicated issue because there's much to it. Because first we have to define what actually is, and there's some kind of circular argumentation here, because in the very famous and also notorious introductory sentence, the very first sentence of the whole book of his political theology stated, he is sovereign who decides upon the state of exception, or about the state of exception. And that can be any governmental body of the executive. In response to the 9/11 attacks, many political commentators have linked this whole neoconservative plot around this cabal around George W. Bush to Schmittian thought, because they advocated for this. I think the term is Unitarian or something like that. This role of the president as controlling by himself the whole executive of the state. They would trace that back to Schmitt and his definition of the sovereign as ruling over the state of exception. But on the other hand, this is not only the sovereign is defined by his ability to the state of exception has come or should be executed, and not the other way around. So Rahman pointed out that people referring to Schmitt would demand or had demanded that Angela Merkel, the German chancellor, should have suspended international law on refugees, which is first false, because what she did by opening the borders was against international law on refugees, but that doesn't really matter here. This is exactly the opposite is true, because people who had read their Carl Schmitt would argue that in the instant that Mrs. Merkel decided to open the German borders to refugees back in 2015, she, by doing so, became, or kind of outed herself as the true sovereign, because she made a pretty lonely, as they say, decision. This is something Schmitt was always all about, his own system of decisionism. Deciding to do something is inherently good, because you actually make a decision instead of just levitating in discourse and not knowing what to do. And she did this on her own and forced it upon the whole nation. So she clearly was the one sovereign of Germany, of the Federal Republic, at least in this very moment. And I believe the political left, the enemy, if you want to stick with this distinction, have always been more confrontational and more ready to, as you say, break some eggs to make their political omelette. And this is something that is absolutely necessary to really understand and to really understand Schmitt and think on from reading his works. That's also why Schmitt was a lot more popular in left-wing circles for a few decades, because conservatives didn't really want it to be associated with him, not publicly at least. And the left was all about a clear distinction between friend and enemy, of course, rather in terms of class struggle and something like that. But they were obviously willing to make their decisions, to say that we distinguish clearly between our friends and our enemies, and to go or in executing this distinction, as we have seen in the new social movements and the student revolts of the late 1960s, all in all Western, and pretty much all Western nations.
Very well said. It makes me wonder if we're at something of an eternal disadvantage, because that confrontational quality you spoke of, that may in fact be biological. That does, not that I'm trying to be too black-pilled and nihilistic here, it does give me some pause. Any thoughts, Mr. Invictus?
Yeah, he brought up the example of Merkel, and I could just as easily bring up examples like George W. Bush saying, well, we don't need consensus. Our idea of cooperation is we're going to invade Iraq, and you're either with us or you're not. So get on the boat or don't. And you have people like Duterte saying, just whatever, kill junkies if you see them. We're not going to prosecute you for it. It's no big deal. We need to get rid of them anyway. But the thing is, like, as many counterexamples as we might be able to cite against Merkel or Obama or anybody else, is that the left seems to have a lot less hand-wringing about it. When people like George W. Bush or Donald Trump are saying, I'm going to decide this exception. This is the time for this state of exception. Right wingers, all the supporters, all the staff of the president, they're all wringing their hands about, oh, how do we make this constitutional? How do we, better yet, how do we present our case of why it's constitutional to the mass media? Because God forbid they write scathing critiques of us. The left, it seems like the more their leaders decide that state of exception, the more they're on board. Because they say, well, if the Constitution comes up against our ideology, then the Constitution is wrong in that instance. And so this state of exception must be made, and we respect Obama or whoever else it is for making that exception even more.
Yeah, very well said. Something I was thinking before, hopefully I'm not just inserting a random thought into this conversation, but it's the romantic quality, I think, of the conservative mind. So the Americana thing that Augustus was talking about before, the frontiersman kind of attitude, pilgrim, you're making this epic journey to this faraway land that might not even be there when you get there. God knows what's going to happen. But it's all this very idealistic, very romantic kind of thing that I wonder if that plays a part in this. Nils, any thoughts? Nils, are you still there? I can hear you, buddy.
I should be.
You're good.
Am I there? Okay. Carl Schmitt has actually written a whole book on this. It's called Political Romanticism. I guess it has been translated under this title. It should have been. And therein the younger Schmitt in his rather far more openly anti-bourgeois than the later Schmitt. This might be one more factor why many conservatives feel somewhat uncomfortable by getting too much into Schmitt. And there he argues that the political romanticism of the late 18th and throughout the 19th century had kind of blurred the vision on realpolitik, because it emphasized certain ideals and values and traditions and pretty much anything that would not have anything to do with politics in the Schmittian sense. And that is the at least potential conflict of interests that has to be fought out in a more or less violent style, either through war or through negotiations and what have you. Any conflicts of interest between different groups and factions within society and community are inevitable. They have to be fixed. Some sort of agreement has to be reached, has to be made, be it after a given war, that a new order is set up. The central thing is that order must be kept. There must not be any time without any order. That would be something like the antinomia, as the ancient Greeks put it, or anomia. And this would lead to civil war, or civil war would lead to enemy, and those are the two things that must never happen in Schmitt's view. So pretty much every means to reach this end and to prevent the order from dissolving and civil war from breaking out is more or less justified in the very Schmittian distinction between legality and legitimacy.
Very well said, and I got to thank you for the book recommendation. I just added Political Romanticism to my Amazon wish list, so thank you for that.
Always glad to be of help.
Any last thoughts, Augustus, before we turn to questions from the chat?
Yeah, sure. My last thoughts on Schmitt would be, Mr. Wigner has mentioned Nomos of the Earth a couple times. It's actually probably my favorite of his books. It begins with noting that law itself is tied to the earth, and it gives three reasons why. But it's distinguished against this liberal international order, which is just all rationalized and it's all abstract law, all like this concept of the rule of law as its own independent entity. But when you really look at Schmitt, what he's talking about is everything is tied to the earth itself. And so I think all of the things really stem from that. It's a spiritual tied to the earth kind of philosophy.
Very well said. So, looking at the chat, there's one burning question. Okay, hold on. A few comments as a question. Well, here's one quick one, and I'll let you guys tackle it however you want. Ender Wiggins is asking both of you to discuss your opinion on optics.
Well, I really don't have an opinion on optics. I think the whole optics debate is horseshit, to be quite frank. I think the people that want to regulate optics, I think they should, in their own groups. I think, if they don't want certain types of people or certain mannerisms at their rallies, then fine. Then hold your rallies and make those rules, and everybody abides by that. But if someone does do something radical, I'm absolutely not going to hold it against them. There was might get in trouble with Joaquin for this example, but back in the 80s, there was a certain group that went around robbing banks, and they thought that declaring war on the government was the best way to, advance the interests of white people. William Pierce knew the guy who was in charge of that group. And when everything went down in flames, William Pierce didn't say, well, these guys were bad optics. We need to disavow them and throw them under the bus because we're not going to get anywhere if we don't sell out to the mainstream conservatives. No, William Pierce wrote an entire essay and gave a whole lecture on why Robert Matthews, while he wouldn't do what he had done, he's not going to disavow him because Matthews was doing what he thought was right. And I think if we all took that approach to optics and said, look, you guys do what you're going to do, just don't let it reflect on us, okay? And we're going to do what we're going to do, but don't throw us under the bus because that's pure cuckery. That's my approach to optics and to not punching right. And so, if people don't attack me, I don't attack them. That's kind of my overarching policy.
Any thoughts, Nils, before we close this down?
Oh, I pretty much am on Augustus' side here. Back in when Charlottesville 2.0 happened, I watched the live stream and saw. I think I remember the guy was walking around and also caught a glimpse at this speech that Asmador gave to the NSM guys and stuff like that. That was it. Just I'm certainly not the one to judge, but this is a global, or at least a Western phenomenon. And over here, you can get arrested for a lot lesser things than what was presented at Charlottesville. It just felt strange because there was this huge rally with all those different groups and many people who were just individuals there, like as it seems James Fields, poor guy, and it just didn't fit because every group was kind of doing what they always do at their own rallies, but they were not really responsible because everyone, as it happened after the whole thing went up in flames, would just blame the organizers and the celebrities like Augustus, like Spencer, and who was there and just happened to be photographed and filmed and what have you. And I mean, all those guys are adults. They should know what they do. One might like it, one might not like it. This whole optics debate is basically trying to make others comply to one's own imagination of what a clean, nice, and neighbor-friendly political movement should look like. And that is the kind of movement that will probably not go that far, besides from posting at universities and whatever. Anyone can do what he feels right. Obviously, I'm not advocating any violence or something like that here. We're just talking about yeah, the way one chooses to look at public events, but one should try not to be too stupid and too upfront about it. And obviously over here in Europe, and especially in Germany, there are some quite a bit more restraints one has to put on himself, not to get arrested and not to make himself look like an idiot. But overall, I would never try and tell people what to do and not to do and what to say and to wear and whatever at their own rallies or events or whatever they have. I'm not that much a fan of public rallies and stuff like that, but whatever floats your boat. I won't join this optics debate.
Yes, well, I appreciate this conversation. I sincerely wish we had more time to continue this, but I do have to go. So why don't you, gentlemen, starting with Augustus, let the audience know where they can find you.
Sure, I'm at Twitter at Emperor Invictus, and my main website with the Revolutionary Conservative and Guerrilla Radio and all my books, everything I do. It's all-devourer.com.
Yeah, right. And I'm obviously, to the audience of this show, my English stuff would be most interesting. So you can find an essay, hopefully more in the future, at the Occidental Observer about rather movement theory, also with a reference to Schmitt. And you'll find me at Twitter and Gab as well, although I'm not really using my Gab account anymore because I don't have the time. Maybe will again in the future as Scototaxis. That's Skototaxis. And well, aside from that, just Google. I guess it's not that popular a name. You'll eventually find me.
Yeah, people will find you quite easily. As for myself, join Jefferson Lee and myself tonight on the Heel Turn Network at 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time as we do our weekly pop culture analysis. This time we're talking about Joel Schumacher's film Falling Down. Monday, I will be back. Go ahead. Yes, Nils.
Yeah, just one more thing. I probably Augustus, as a huge acolyte of Francis Parker Yockey, knows this, but for any alt-writer and people around the whole movement who's still not convinced whether or not he should get into Schmitt, I recommend a longer essay from the Occidental Quarterly that can be found online. It's from the winter 2010-2011 issue, where some Sebastian Linderhof examines the hidden influence Carl Schmitt had on Yockey's Imperium, which is quite extensive and very interesting to read.
Good to know. Thank you very much. Well, to the audience, I'll see you later tonight. And to you, gentlemen, I hope very much, and I'm sure that we will be having conversations again in the future. Everyone, take care of yourselves.
Thank you.
Thank you.